Hi everyone, welcome to our mid-year webinar. I'm Terence. I'm the co-founder of ACE Clinic and also the head tutor for economics. If you didn't catch my previous webinar that I did at the start of the year, it will be wonderful if you take a look at that before you look at this one. That gives you a overview on economics, and it'll be particularly useful if you are in J1 or your child is in J1. That gives you good perspective of what economics is like and how it should be studied. Now, today, what I want to do is very simple. It's really to check in and to help all of you here figure out, are you on track, right? Are you on track as you reach the halfway point in J1? Are you on track as you reach the halfway point in J2? And what that means for, how you're going to fare for your promo exams or, of course, the A-levels. So the first thing I want to talk about is how to interpret your grades, right? So for most of you at this point in the year, you probably would have had one or two tests. Even for the J1, you'll probably have at least one graded assignment so far. And I think a lot of times what students struggle with is you don't actually know what your grades mean, right? So especially for those of you that are not doing well and like getting U's and S's, it might be like, okay, I know things are not going well, but I don't know what to do about it, right? Or you might be on the other end of the spectrum. You might be scoring a B or C, and you might still be like, I don't know. I don't feel very confident, right? I don't know how I'm going to do eventually, whether is it for promos or A-levels. So what we're going to look at today is really to help you decipher, right, your grades and tell you what it means and more critically, what to do. Now, the first thing I like to begin with, right, as I like to advise most parents and students is, it is, of course, important to look at the grade that you're scoring, but most of the time, it is infinitely more important to understand why you got that grade, like to break down the components of your grade rather than just looking at the overall figure. And I'm going to elaborate more about that as we go through the slides today. So let's start with a very broad categorization of your grades and what it says about your proficiency. Okay, so let's start with A's and B's. Okay, I think that's a good place to start. The first thing I would say is that if you are in J2, your A's and B's are worth more. If you are in J1, your A's and B's are worth a little bit less. And the reason for that is because obviously, being just 5 months into J1, doing a new subject, the school is typically not unreasonable. They do dial things down a little bit for you. But what that also means is, as compared to what you might see later on in your promo exams or especially A-levels, there is going to be a slight difference in, the difficulty. That is not to say you don't deserve a pat on the back if you're scoring A's and B's. It does mean that you are quite on track. But I think my main point is we want to ward against complacency. Okay, so let's start with A and B. Now, if you're scoring an A and B, regardless of whether it is essay or CSQ, then the first thing that is certainly the case is that you must know your content well, and you must have good mastery of the question requirements. In other words, you are meeting what the mark scheme needs, and you are able to produce economic content, right? You are able to write things in an economically rigorous fashion. You're able to, write things that they expect an econ student to write. So you're definitely on track, right? That means you are not guessing when you're attempting a question. You are not just, describing your answers in whatever words and phrases first come to mind, but it is very deliberate, right? I would say in one word, if you are scoring an A and B, then your answers must be very deliberate. You must be making a deliberate effort to write your answer in a certain way. And it definitely means that you're on track. Now, what you should be doing if you're scoring an A and B, then I would definitely recommend more exam grade practices, right? So if you don't have the 10-year series, that's probably a good place to start, right? Grab the 10-year series, look at the A-level questions. Don't have to be able to do all of them very well right now, but start building towards A-level proficiency. Now, if you're at a C and D, right? A C and D. So just for reference, right? If you're in a C and D, that means you're in the 50 to 59% range, right? And then of course, A and B will be 60% plus. To hit an A, you need 70%. Okay. So if you're at a C and D range, what that typically means is you know enough to pass. So you know the content, but not super well. So it means that your strategy right now is probably a bit more scattershot, you know? Like you see a question and you're putting down whatever you can think of, and there's enough econs in that to help you pass. But because it's a bit scattershot, your answer becomes a bit patchy. So it's like you're not very sure. And that uncertainty actually shines through. And that's why you're not getting the highest end of the marks. So if A and B suggest that your answers are quite deliberate, you're quite capable, then C and D suggests some uncertainty, right? It suggests some doubts about where you are, right? Especially in terms of answering questions. So the biggest weakness here, just now for A and B, I said more exam grade practices. For C and D, really, what you just need is more practices. What you definitely need is more practices. You need to practice applying content to questions, because there is ultimately that gulf, right? Whereby when you are studying content, you don't get tested exactly how you get taught. So you need to be aware of question requirements and be able to deliver on that. So practices start to divert your attention away from just mugging and start doing more practices. Start looking and exposing yourself at more questions to get used to what the mark schemes want. And finally, if you're in the ESU range, so an E would be, well, basically this is all going to be less than 50%, right? So obviously a U is really bad. That's the lowest possible grade. It stands for ungraded, and then you have S, and then you have E, right? And so when students get an ESU, typically what this means is content is a major problem. Okay, content is a major problem. So what do we mean by content is a major problem? Content is a major problem in the sense that your answer would definitely have insufficient or incorrect economics. That means you're either not writing enough because you don't realize those things are important, or you're writing things that are patently wrong from an economic standpoint. So it's quite scary, right? That means a lot of times it means that what you think you know isn't actually what you know, right? You go for lectures, you read your notes, and you're like, hey, yeah, that makes sense. But when you actually write it out, you are not writing what you are learning. And sometimes it needs someone else to identify that for you. So a good marker, right, is if you're getting ES and U, that means you probably don't understand the content as well as you think. And more critically, the lack of question awareness is even more acute here. That means, now don't get me wrong, right? Some people actually study quite hard. And they try to study the notes and they try to memorize and they try to regurgitate whatever the notes say, but they still fail. And if that were the case, that means this second point is what's dragging you down. That means you look at a question and what you thought it is about is not what it actually is about, which means you're not answering the question. And that can be quite severe as well. The good news is if the latter is your problem, that is an easier fix. But very frequently, what we see every year is that if you are scoring, especially S and U's, and you come to ask for classes, 9 out of 10 students have this problem and not the second problem. So in terms of what you need to do when you're scoring an ESU, the first thing that you really need to do is you do need to mark harder and to some extent smarter as well. You need to find ways to commit economic content to memory and start writing answers that resemble the explanations that you find in your notes, right? Trying to put things in your own words probably isn't working too well for you. So this is the basic, right? This is what it means. This is the 3 buckets that we think about where you are when you're scoring the various grades. Okay, now let's go into more detail, right? So what to do next, right? What to do next? To put the recommendations earlier into more formal terms. If you're getting A's and B's, you can afford to focus more on difficult questions. And that's why earlier I mentioned the TYS, right? Because this is a good benchmark that you need to hit. The TYS questions are not all difficult, but there is a number of difficult questions in there. So if you're really a solid A, especially if you're in J2, then TYS will definitely be your best friend. If you're in J2 and you are quite okay with TYS already, that's where you want to start getting prelim questions from other schools and focus exclusively on the harder stuff just to build your confidence and proficiency. If you're in J1, I would say 10-year series is more than enough. If you're scoring C's and D's, as I said, practice is important, right? Because it probably means that your Mark-C mastery is not that great, but some selective content revision is probably in order, right? To help you polish up your knowledge, help you be more precise in how you're thinking about what questions need and, make your answers not so scattershot and not so scattergun. Now, finally, if you're in the ESU range, then you got to do a lot of lit work first in terms of content. So I strongly recommend mind maps. I'm biased towards it. It works great for me. I know it doesn't work great for everyone, but what I tell all my students is, even if you don't like mind maps, you need to find some way to compress your knowledge. Whether you want to use flashcards, mind maps, completely up to you. How much you want to summarize your notes, completely up to you. But you need to do some degree of compressing your knowledge, of organizing your knowledge, because econs is a huge topic, is a huge subject, right? If you add up all your lecture notes over the 2 years, by the time you reach the end of it, you're looking at 600 to 700 pages easily. So if you don't have a way of organizing your knowledge, organizing that information, trying to commit that to memory, writing answers will be extremely difficult for you. Okay, so definitely need to do the groundwork, make sure the theory is there before we think about practices. Now, let's break things down, right? So obviously, some of you might have been doing essays, some maybe CSQs, right? Some of you maybe both, especially in J2. So we're going to look at essays and CSQs in turn, right? So we talked about interpreting your grades generically. Now let's talk more about, okay, like what does my essay score mean and what does my CSQ score mean and how do I interpret those things? So the first thing I want to flash here is, some sample essay questions, especially for you parents in the crowd. Maybe you don't know what an essay looks like, right? So this is what an essay looks like, okay? So essay questions, this is from the TYS. It can be a 25-mark essay, right? That's one question. Or it could be split into a 10-mark and a 15-mark. This is also considered one question, all right? So an essay, as the name suggests, is we give you a heading and you're supposed to write, a long prose answer, right? I would say that great essays, you want to score an A, you got to be hitting 4 pages plus, right? It means in totality. If it's a 25-mark question, 4 pages plus. If it's an A and B, they add up together, should be 4 pages plus. And I don't mean 4 pieces of paper. I mean 4 sides of a foolscap paper. That's not short. Okay, that's not something that you can just wake up and do. You do need to practice, but that is basically the benchmark that we're looking at, and you have about 45 minutes to write an essay. Now, if you're in J1, they might be quite kind. They might be giving you longer. They might be giving you 50 minutes. Sometimes they give you an hour, sometimes even more. But at the A levels, eventually, that's all the time you have. And that's why I say, if you're scoring an A in J1, good on you, but not time to rest on your laurels, right? There's still some distance to work towards final exam proficiency. Now, because of the format of an essay, it's a long prose, right? I give you a question. I mean, even in a slightly longer question like this one, it's not that long. So you have a question like that, and you're supposed to churn out 4 pages of content. Now, I like to say this, right? Which is, when you don't do well in an essay, especially if it's 25 marks, it is typically not that worrying. Now, what do I mean, right? Essays are very punishing in the sense that once your answer structure, that means in that 4 pages, right? If there is no deliberation, remember just now I said that if you were AB student, that means your answer is very deliberate, right? So as long as you're not deliberate, that means if your essay is a patchwork, there is no strategy, there is no deliberation about what to include, then you fail quite easily, regardless of the quality of what you're writing, right? So I like to say in essays, structure is really quite important. And because of that, typically, if you're failing essays, especially in J1, you don't have to worry too much. It's not a good sign, of course, because if you don't fix it, it's not going to fix itself. But it doesn't mean that you're hopeless at the subject. You do have to look a little bit more deeply. And so to look a bit more deeply, I'm going to simplify the marking scheme for you and teach you how to think about how essays are scored. So there are three key dimensions of grading essays. The first has to do with what I said earlier about deliberate and structure. The first determinant of a good essay score is its completeness, which is, did you include everything that's important? Or is your essay overly narrow or, in a similar vein, overly brief? Neither works. You cannot just list 12 points in your essay and expect to score. Neither can you just write an essay about 1 point. You need to have a healthy number of points, right, that answers the question. Now, this is where practice becomes very important. You don't practice, you don't look at model answers, you don't look at mark schemes. Trust me, it is impossible to score. It is impossible to do well for econs if all you do is to read the notes and you never study enough questions. Because every subject is like that. The mark scheme has a certain preset requirements there. You don't meet those requirements, literally what you write is irrelevant. So completeness is key. That is literally one of the first things you need to get right if you want to do well in an essay. So earlier I mentioned, right, if you're in a C and D range and you are able to pass, right, it means that you know enough econs such that even you just plug any of those few points and you write, you will probably hit enough marking points to get a complete enough essay to pass. But if you are failing, that means you either completely don't know what the essay is about or you don't remember enough content to even have a chance to pass. So completeness is number one. Number two is quality. Quality at the end of the day is about regurgitation. So you need to be able to spew economic information, draw diagrams, use concepts. Long story short is a good quality answer sounds like a textbook. So what I advise a lot of my students is it's really not worth being creative with how you write your econs essays. You are really better off just pretty much replicating whatever the notes say. Now, that is not to say that you cannot use your own words. But when it comes to the core economic theory, we need key terms. We need to have the key terms. You need to articulate the cause and effect exactly like how it is taught to you. You don't have a lot of wiggle room. Because once you deviate from what's in the lecture note, there's a very high risk that it will be wrong. So quality is about, let's try to, keep things simple. How the notes teach to us, we try to replicate the explanation. That will ensure a high quality answer. And finally comes application. Does your essay answer the question or are you just regurgitating? So regurgitation is important, but it's not enough for an A. You need to apply, you need to link back, you need to explain how does the theory you present answer the question. So if we take these three dimensions and we think about scoring, here's how to think about it. When you got completeness and quality, you will get a B. Okay? So you remember just now I said, if you're in a C and D, you can pass, right? That means you have enough content to pass. Normally, C and D students are a bit stronger here and a bit weaker there. Okay? If you're a bit stronger in quality and a bit weaker in completeness, then you will be in the CD range. But if you can do decent on completeness, that means you see a question, you're like, aha, I know these are the points you have to talk about. I'm marked enough to be able to put in an econs answer, I get a B. Okay? You want to get an A? The cherry on top is you need application. So I tell everyone this, I said, look, everyone likes an A, right? Let's be real, everyone likes an A. But if you look at the schools, right, when you're doing a school exam, the A rate is typically 10% or less. And this is ridiculous. This is lower than the kind of A rate that you would expect to see at A levels. So the schools make the standard higher. So I always tell my students, I say, let's not fixate about an A first. Don't worry about an A. Don't worry about the application yet. I'm not telling you not to strive for an A. I'm saying until you can do this, don't worry about an A. Get consistent with a B first. Every question you see, be able to tell me, What points do we need? Are you able to deliver on those points? That means completeness is about strategy, it's about structure, right? It's about, okay, this question needs what? This is about execution. So until you can consistently do these two things, then we can't worry about application. Because at the end of the day, application cannot mark. You cannot mark application. Application comes from practicing, comes from understanding. It's the ultimate higher order skill. And as it is, as you're going through JC, you have more than enough things to worry about. So let's worry about application when we get close to A levels, right? We're talking about if you're in J2, final term of the year, that's when we start focusing on application. For J1, don't worry. Stay the course first. That's the most important thing. Every essay consistent, completeness, quality, completeness, quality. You can do that, you will very easily shoot to an A eventually. So the long story short today is, if you have been doing essays and you haven't been doing well, I want you to look at where is your shortcoming. And most of the time, I mean, if you're failing, don't even need to think about this. Just look at these two things. And between these two things, this is the easier one to fix. This is the first thing I want all of you to strive to fix, which is, how's the quality of my answer? Am I making things up in my own words? Am I explaining the causes and effects correctly? Or am I just, approximately there? This can be solved by studying, right? Committing it to knowledge, working on it harder. Once you are able to get some content mastery, then you can't worry about completeness. Then you start looking at answers, right? Essays. So for those of you that are failing because you can do quality, but your completeness is off, okay, it's easier problem to solve. Look at more questions, do more practices, look at more mark schemes, look at more model essays, right? To help you align your regurgitation more towards what the marking schemes need. If your quality has issue, then you don't really bother about this first. Because if you don't fix your quality issue, even you know what to write, is not enough. Okay? So that's essays. So I like to think about building proficiency in essays in 4 steps, in 4 phases. Okay? You start with open book. You start with your notes. Because if you cannot look at an essay and figure out what the essay needs, open book, then there's no way you can do it from memory. Your main objective here is very simple. 1 word, selection. You see, you have to remember this. Econs is a content subject. Whatever they test you needs to come from your notes. So if you look at your notes and you cannot tell what they want, that means what should I copy and paste over, then you have a huge problem, right? So you need to look at the question and go, okay, what part of the notes do they want? Right? Is it this point? That's step 1. After you can do that, then if you refer to your notes, can you write a good quality essay or not? Can you find the right things to regurgitate? Okay? Once you can do that, then we think about closed book. Can you analyze the question closed book? Can you think of what you need? Not the details yet, not the paragraphs, but can you think of, oh, this question needs what? I know that this topic has this particular concept that I need to raise. This is what the question wants. So that's what I mean by closed book question analysis. And then, of course, finally, closed book answer writing. So, of course, we hope to be able to leave this behind as soon as possible and just focus on that. And the closer you get to exams, the more you should be doing this. Okay? Because as I told you already, completeness is king. You got to be able to get the answer structure right. Right? So practicing as much as questions as possible, as much exposure as possible to figure out what the question wants is very crucial to doing well. So that's essays. Let's talk about case studies, right? So this is applicable for the H1 students, in the crowd today as well. So of course, the H1 and H2 CSQ look slightly different, but the format is generally the same, which is you get a bunch of questions. So it's not like essay, right? Essay is just, 1 title or 2, and then you have to write a very long prose. CSQ answers are shorter. The longest question you get in H2 is 10 marks. If you're a H1 student, it can go up to 12 marks. But they're quite similar. I mean, these questions will be about 1 page plus in terms of length. Like you can get a very good score with a 1 page plus answer already. Still considerably shorter than an essay, right? So the format is very different. I think the first thing that people think about when they do CSQ is it looks like comprehension, right? You got passages. Here, I only show you 1 example of 1 extract, but a typical case study will easily have 3 to 4 extracts. And then you have a bunch of questions of varying marks, right? Varying lengths. Now, while it might look like comprehension, the first thing I like to preach is please don't ever do a CSQ like comprehension. The reason being, when you actually do an English comprehension, there's a certain degree of improvisation. Like English, right? When you do English comprehension, it's not a content subject. We didn't teach you information and facts that you have to remember to answer the question. It's just, can you understand the author's intent? That's what I mean by improvisation. But Econs is not like that. Econs needs regurgitation. You still need to use economic concepts. So in that regard, Econs CSQ is very different from comprehension. Okay, so keep that in mind. Now let me talk about the dimensions of CSQ grading. Okay, so I'm going to put the 2-mark questions aside for today. So for those of you that have done CSQ before, you know that there are those short 2-mark questions. I'm going to put that aside for a moment. Okay, we're not going to worry too much about that first. Let's think about the rest, which is the bulk of the marks. For your 3 to 7-mark questions, right, those of moderate length, there are 3 things that are very important when we are marking your CSQ. The most important thing, right, is precision. Point selection is king. This is the part that makes it a bit more difficult than essays, right? Because a CSQ question, like a 3-mark question, is very short only. A 3-mark question is maybe 4 to 6 lines, foolscap lines long. Even a 7-mark question, maybe it's about half page and a bit more. Because the answers are so short, a scattergun strategy doesn't work, right? Today you're writing an essay, it's 1 over page long. You write. More or less you can squeeze some econs in, to pick up some marks. But in CSQ, the chances of getting a 0 in your 3 to 7-mark questions is surprisingly high. And if you see zeros, very simple. You get a 0, it's seldom because of this. You get a 0 for the question, it's because of this. So now, again, I'm teaching you how to dissect your paper. Now, just now I said, essay, you get a U and S, not that worrying, right? Because it's 1 long prose, it's very demanding. You need to figure out the right scope, make the right explanation and all that. Now, if you're failing CSQ, it tends to be more worrying, especially if you're failing miserably. Let me say that most okay students, right? Most okay students, if you can squeeze into the E to C range, I would say, okay, you're probably all right. Not great work to be done, but you're all right. But you're failing miserably, you're getting 9 out of 30, right? You're getting S and U's for CSQ. That is infinitely scarier than S and U's for essay. Because you get so many small short questions, but yet you cannot cobble enough marks to maximize your score. So especially when you see zeros popping up, then you know you got a big precision issue. And if you got a big precision issue, you need to work on recognizing questions first. You need to know your content. Again, content is always the foundation, but you need to be able to look at a question and go, they are testing me on this. Because if you can't do that, what you write after that point doesn't matter. You will fail regardless. So number 1 is precision. Once you figure out what the question was, the next thing is this. This in CSQ shouldn't be hard to do because you don't have to write a full essay. Just very short only. Your burden of memorization is not that high. The main thing I need to emphasize to all of you is the need for rigor. That means when you analyze your answer, okay, so this is the telltale sign. So for precision, I say you get 0. Normally it's a precision problem. Rigor, here's the problem, okay? You only pass although you thought you know how to do the question. That is the scary thing. So a lot of people will go into CSQ, right? CSQ is the one that gives you a lot of root shots. Because people will go into a CSQ paper and they'll be like, oh yeah, I think it's okay. All the questions quite doable. Come out, they will fail. Because there are questions that they misinterpret and questions that they thought they can do, they only pass. And that is not acceptable because as it is, it's already hard enough to figure out what the question was. You can figure out and you don't maximize the score, it's a massive problem. And what's the reason? Typically, it's because you never regurgitate. People are too descriptive. That's why I said, don't think of CSQ like a comprehension. It is a massive problem if you do. So you need to be rigorous, you need to regurgitate, you need to copy and paste the econs theory from memory. But comparatively speaking, this is the harder thing to do for CSQ because you don't have to write a lot. Rigor shouldn't be hard to achieve as long as you're deliberate about it and you studied for it, of course. Finally, structure. Okay. Now, this is a bigger problem when it's a bigger mark question. So more for the 6 and 7 mark question, which is, I like to sometimes refer to this as the technical aspect of the question. Whereas the two things on the left are the content aspect of the question. So the technical aspect is really understanding the mark scheme. Do you understand the mark scheme? Do you know what the mark scheme wants? Do you know how many points you need? And it's really about fulfilling that. Okay. So in fact, structure is probably the easiest thing to do here, right? Because it's just about familiarizing yourself with the format and being able to deliver on the required style of answer. So this is for the 3 to 7 mark questions. The 8 to 10 mark question, okay. Similar, you see the similar elements. Of course, you still need rigor. You still need structure. The structure for the 8 to 10 mark questions is more fixed. Okay, this applies to up to the 12 mark questions for H1s also. So the beauty about the 8 to 10 mark questions, the 12 mark questions for you H1 kids is that the structure is quite expected. You always need a two-sided answer and you need an evaluation. You got no two-sided answer, you confirm won't pass one. So two-sided answer means pros and cons, good and bad. That's what we mean by two-sided answer. Okay, so the structure is easy. Rigor is just, once again, you need to regurgitate econs. A lot of times, people go into CSQ and they get distracted. They look at the question, they look at the case, they start improvising. You look at the case and then you quote and then you explain the quote. You cannot do that. You cannot explain the quote based on intuition. We need regurgitation. That is to say, even though this is CSQ, it is an application paper, but 70% of your answer should be theory. Okay, I need a healthy dose of regurgitation. Now, what makes the 8 and 10 mark questions very hard to score well in? Let me share this to you. If you can do the structure, you dump enough content inside, it's very easy to pass. So I tell all my students, I say, for your 8 and 10 mark question, the first thing I need you all to master is pass. Structure, always correct. Cannot compromise, please. I mean, it's as simple as I need 2 sides. It cannot be, you cannot give me 2 sides. And I need you to dump econs into it. So don't think too hard in the sense that your job is to think about what content should I regurgitate. Even if you still feel a bit uncertain, don't go and improvise. You improvise, you sure fail. So go and think, okay, what does the question mean? I think it's this topic. I think it's that concept. Let's just regurgitate. Rigor. So you do these 2 things, very easy to pass, right? So if you're not passing, you're getting 2 out of 10, 1 out of 10, 2 out of 8, you probably are either failing in one of these departments. Now, when you want a really, really good score, that is where CSQ is hard. That's where your 8 and 10 mark questions are hard. Context. Okay. Point selection becomes even harder. You see, the difference is this. For the short mark questions, the precision is more straightforward in the sense that they are normally only testing one concept, right? You need to find that one concept and then you just write it. The 8 and 10 mark questions are like mini essays. There are multiple things that they expect you to select from the case. And not only must you select those things, you must think about how to argue them, how to argue the points, how to frame the points. And that's really important. So did you prioritize the points in the data? Did you extract the right amount of points? Did you make good arguments with them? So that's considerably more difficult to do. So here is how I advocate for all of you to analyze your CSQ scores if you have been doing CSQ. For the short mark questions, you need to go and look for the zeros and the passes. What are the things you get 0 for? That means you need to work on your question analysis. Do you know what they're testing? What are the questions that you thought you were doing okay, but you only passed, you never get maximum marks? Look at your answer. Compare to your lecture notes. How much rigor do you provide? How well do you explain? How much details did you give? Was it improvised or do you actually copy and paste from memory based on your lecture notes? And then for the 8 to 10 mark questions, the first thing to look out for is, are you passing? If you're passing, you're okay. Work more on this. But if you're not passing, then you probably have an issue in these areas. Okay? Now, for CSQ, you want to master it. Very similar process to essays. You begin with open book question analysis, right? This is especially to train your precision. your point selection. If you got your notes in front of you and you still can't select the right thing, then that's a serious problem, right? You need to work on that first. There's no chance for you to do it in memory otherwise, right? So look at the question, look at your book. What are they testing? Oh, this is demand and supply. Oh, they want non-price determinants. You must be able to tell. Once you can do that, then you start practicing writing your answers in the prose. Let me talk about this very quickly. You saw this step in essays also. Between essay and CSQ, there's more value in writing out the answers for essay. Because writing 2-3 lines versus being able to write 1 over page, 4 pages in total for essay is a different proposition altogether. You don't get the hang of having to write that much and say that much. You will never have enough things to say. You will always find that, hey, the essay, I don't have things to say already. Then you will always not do well. So for essay, it's super important to do the writing. For CSQ, honestly, it's considerably less important because the answers are very short. They shouldn't be hard to construct. That is not to say you shouldn't practice. I'm just trying to contrast. Essay, extremely important. CSQ, okay. If anything, the things you should be writing answers for is your 8 and 10 mark questions because they are like mini essays. Because you need to argue. Your arguments matter. So for this, it matters a bit more. Okay, so analyze the case, learn to practice writing the answers. Another reason why writing CSQ answer isn't the most important thing first is because if your this step is wrong, your this step will be junk. Okay, so once you can do open book, move on to closed book. This is key. I tell all my students this. The day you can sit down and you can analyze a case fully from memory, just based on your analysis, you don't have to write the answer. You analyze the case, you can analyze it for me. I can tell you what you will score without you having to write a single word of your answer. If your analysis is poor, you will never pass. It doesn't matter. I don't need you to write to be able to show me. If your analysis is great, you will never drop below a B. Okay? So be able to analyze the question and the case, close book. Connect the dots. This question is about what? That case is about what? What is this extract saying? Oh, it's about economic growth. Oh, that's about GDP. This is about fiscal policy. Connect the dots. Extremely important. CSQ at the end of the day is about connecting the dots. And then finally, close book answer writing. All right? That's how to practice your CSQ. The last thing I want to talk about, so we talk about essays, we talk about CSQs, we talk about how they're marked, right? We talk about how to analyze how well you're doing, what does it mean, when you're not doing things well, how to break things down, right? The last thing I want to say is this, right? So not necessarily applicable to everyone. I hope most of you have spent a lot of time studying, right? For your econs, wherever you have a test. But for those of you that are not doing it, this is where I preach a little bit, right? A very common misconception, right, that people have about econs is it's like humanities. People find it very fluffy, and there's a tendency to want to go into an exam and just wing it, treat it like English GP paper and then just write whatever comes to mind. It doesn't work. Econs, as I like to say, it's a bit like a science. Okay? It's a bit like a science. So I will parallel it to biology because this is the most content-heavy science. And the thing about biology, every bio student knows that you need keywords, that when you study things like photosynthesis, it cannot just be approximate, it cannot be, like primary school answer, I need sunlight and water and then I can have photosynthesis. I mean, that's not good enough, right? Like you need the detailed cause and effect, right? You need the detailed process, you need the key terms, you need to be able to write like a bio student. Econs is like that. So you cannot afford to go into an econs exam roughly understanding the concept. A lot of students come into us, every time they inquire for classes, the first thing they tell us is, oh, I understand the lectures in school, I just cannot write the answers. And that can't be further from the truth. Most students that come in and tell us that, when we start working with them and looking at their practice essays and all that, we realize the same issue, which is you don't really understand the content because you're not writing the content in a high enough level, right? The quality is not there. And compounding to that problem is you probably don't have the information organized in your head. So for example, right, what we mean by needing to test yourself concepts, needing to do memory work is, today if I ask you this chapter for econs, demand and supply, I ask you, what did you learn inside there? You should be able to give me an overview. Oh, I learned non-price determinants, I learned the price mechanism, I learned to explain what happens when demand shifts and how do we get from one equilibrium to another. That's memory work. Because if you recall what we just said for CSQ, the ability to look at a question and figuring out what they're testing you is extremely important. If you don't organize your knowledge, you have no fighting chance. So here's how we suggest what you do when you're doing memory work. The first thing to do, again, I'm biased to my maps, but what I'm really asking for is I need to begin with a bird's eye view. I need you to be able to do what I just said, which is if I ask you what's in this chapter, you can tell me what your learning outcomes are supposed to be. What are the key concepts? What do you have to learn? And so on. So that's one. Number two, execution. You gave me the bird's eye view. You tell me all the theories. Can you explain them in an economically rigorous fashion? Now, let me tell you this. This belongs more in the rote learning category, right? Because this is more marking heavy. This one is about organizing knowledge. Between the two, this is more important. You cannot afford this to slip. You cannot afford to let this slip. Because not even knowing that the theory exists is a very big problem. You confirm cannot answer questions. So you can afford to let your rigor, your memory of the concepts decay over time and top up in and around exam season. What you cannot afford to lose is you cannot afford to completely forget what you learned in a certain chapter. So always start broad, bird's eye view first. Hey, what is this chapter about? Then can I explain everything in the chapter? And then finally, then it comes to applications, which is, this is where your practices come in, because you start looking at questions and you go, oh, this is about this is about that, this is about that topic, so on and so forth. Okay, so don't neglect the memory work. Okay, this is the foundation of doing well in econs. You don't do the memory work, you will never do well in econs, right? All my best students fail in many different ways, but I would say by and large, the students that consistently get A's and B's, right, have one thing in common. Every one of them makes their own notes and they're quite consistent about it. That is a very, very important ingredient to wanting to do well. People don't do well by just reading lecture notes and winging it in exam. It doesn't work. You gotta make notes. Okay? And that's it. We've come to the end of the webinar. I hope you got some insight about how to analyze how you're doing, whether you're on track or not. I think the main thing that I want to leave you with is, while I started today talking about how to bucket yourself into, A and B students, C and D students and all that, I think especially if you're in the, DESU bucket, it's not about, labeling yourself as a bad student. Today's webinar is about how to identify your issues more granularly and what the solutions might look like to lift your grades, right? So you want to start working on those areas, practicing some of the tips that I gave you, and hopefully when your mid-year exams roll around, you start seeing a modest uplift in marks. And here's the thing, even when it comes to grade improvements, we like to improve our grades. We like to go from a U to an A. But even before that, it is important to look at how your answer quality is evolving. Because even you are stuck at a U, but you had a very low U, go to a very high U, that's improvement. Or you might be stuck at a D, but maybe the quality of your answer improved. Maybe you are able to do some areas of the CSQ paper better, but some areas still weak. That is still also improvement. So let's not just focus on the overall grade, but as I started today, focus on why you're getting those grades. What's the breakdown of the issues that's constraining you to a certain score range? And once you figure that out and you use the right strategies to help yourself improve, then you're going to see your grades improve very quickly. Thanks for joining me today. That's all. I hope to see some of you in class down the road. On this slide, our contact details. You can contact Sean, our marketing director, for more information about classes. Thank you and have a very good rest of the day.